Let me bring her back over here.
And I say it is 81 degrees outside right now. Thank God.
What?
Oh my God.
81? Wow.
81. I am telling you, and it's supposed to be close to that all week. And I just don't know how to act. I've been standing around outside with this dumbfounded look on my face.
Wow. I mean, it wasn't 81 here. It was a beautiful day, sunshiny and a beautiful breeze. We spent almost the entire day out on the back deck with my grandbaby and him in his little walker stroller like thing running around on the back deck. So, but it was not 81 here.
Well, and it's perfect weather to get a finish to lay down on a piece of wood.
On a bookshelf.
Makes me excited. Yep.
All right.
A literal shelf for a literal book.
Well, about, I don't know, 27 literal books and counting. Right. Yeah. All right. So we're live on Rumble, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I do have to say a couple of things to begin with. I'm telling you that today, more than a normal day, there's a lot of retarded people on X today. I don't usually ever block anybody. I blocked 3 people today just because they're retarded. And as I've go ahead.
The bots are out in force, including filling up my inbox.
Yes. So as I've explained to everybody, if someone wants to engage in a dialogue, I'll engage in a dialogue. If not for the person that I'm having a conversation with, for the people that are watching and reading the dialogue. But you actually have to be able to have a dialogue. The one guy today pops up and says, yeah, all of the Tate murders was all Gladio, and it was, X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, okay, so where's your research and where's the documentation that says all of that? Well, it's true. No, I don't. And I'd like to see some references, some sources, something. And then, 2 or 3 other people glom on and go, oh, he's so smart. He's done all of this research. Well, if he's done all the research, let me see it. It should be easy. It should be at his fingertips. So not only did he get blocked because he's a dumbass, but the person that came in and was basically telling me that I was way out of line by calling him on the fact that he's making a bunch of assertions he has no actual evidence of, and that we don't do that here because it ruins our credibility. You guys know, even when there is a pattern that I notice, which is my second point here in a second, I'm very leery of actually saying something is factual, even if it fits every pattern of a Gladio operation, if we don't have some piece of evidence that links them. So on that point, I have noticed over the last 3 days, today the most significantly, but over the last 3 days, there is a concerted effort by, I'm not going to say hundreds because that's an exaggeration, but upwards of 50 posts before I ever even said a word. And I said it today. There is a concerted effort to steer the public away from the Taliban. And I want to tell you something, and the reason why I noticed this. You guys know that as I went through this whole process over the last 2 years, there are some things that I have a big question mark about. They look odd, they sound odd, but I don't know why. And I have been very honest with you guys when I come across them that I don't know. So the Taliban has always been a very interesting enigma in the Gladio research, because everything tells me that it was, and trust me, just like with the Chinese and the Russians and everybody else, I'm not a Taliban fan. What I want to tell you is what I have read and the research bears out. Back a long time ago, decades ago, the effort to bring opium into Afghanistan and harvest it there because of the mountainous regions, which is where it grows the best, was concerted among the CIA and various other intel, specifically Pakistan, because obviously Pakistan is one of those made up countries that we've basically controlled since the beginning. And when I say we, I mean MI6, NATO, and all of those. And all of the heroin processing labs were set up inside of Pakistan while the growing was being done inside of Afghanistan, which, again, it's just a data point. So if you go back and you look at the history of the Taliban was the ones that did not want opium grown in Afghanistan. Now, does that make them right on every other point? No, it doesn't. I'm just telling you this one point. They also, after the first Gulf War, changed, basically eradicated to the extent possible the opium growth, which is why a lot of it moved to South America. But they had changed crops. In the research that we did, we found out they were growing grapes, they were growing olive trees, and all of this other stuff to diversify and get away from opium because it was not their thing. Now, obviously, the people that were making a shit ton of money in Afghanistan, like the residual Mujahideen and some of the other warlords, just like what happened in China, people, there were warlords that did not want to give up the cash crop of opium. And the Taliban was constantly fighting against them in order to get people off of opium. So I find it very interesting. And the reason why I said all of that is the Taliban is not Al-Qaeda. It is not Mujahideen. It was not the Northern Alliance. It was not ISIS. It was not any of those. Those were all set up by the CIA and have always been at war with the Taliban. So I find it very interesting that in a propaganda campaign, you would see exactly what we're seeing happen on X. Just random accounts showing up in my timeline that are all espousing how bad the Taliban is, how they've shut down all of the schools, how they've murdered all of these people. And it's just, they're not big accounts. It's a random propaganda campaign that is going on X. And yes, I notice it because I look for those things, especially in areas that, as we've done Operation Gladio exposure, I still have questions. I look for anyone talking about that subject, and I have a heightened awareness, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And there is something going on with the Taliban right now that a certain population is trying to discredit, and I am sure that we will find out why. So just pay attention to that, guys. All right. We are going to move on to our, there's SR71. Let me bring him up. We are going to move on to our next book. And that book, as we mentioned yesterday, is called Drugs, Oil, and War. And it kind of makes the whole argument that we've been making of how they're all interrelated. And this book particularly, it's not a very long book, goes into Afghanistan, Colombia, and Indochina, which is basically Vietnam. So let's get started. And I am going to talk through the preface because after having read this book, it is a very interesting kind of introduction. So I have several places highlighted. I'm going to go over those areas now. Basically, he says that the book explores the factors that engendered a U.S. strategy of indirect intervention in third world countries through alliances for drug trafficking proxies. This strategy was originally developed in the late 1940s as it pertained to China. So you know he knows. And just for a point of reference, this book was written and copyrighted in 2003, just so that you have a context situationally from when it was being written, which, as we know, is 2 years after 9/11, on the precipice of us going back into Afghanistan and Iraq. The strategy, let's see, it was used to secure control over foreign petro resources. So he's saying that the drug trafficking was going to be, the money generated from it was going to be used by the syndicate in order to fund regime change wars to control oil. The result had been a staggering increase in the global drug trafficking and mafia-ish presence of the hoodlums associated with it. The book also talks about covert interventions and escalations as it relates to those wars. He said part 1 and 2 are chapters on Afghanistan and Colombia, and part 3 consists of updated chapters from his 1972 book, The War Conspiracy, The Secret Road to the Second Indochina War, which is our war with Vietnam. The first one is considered the French War with Vietnam. He goes on to say that under pressure from interested outsiders, decisions was made in the U.S. after World War II, in Burma, and again in Laos in 1959 through 65 to back armies and governments that were supporting themselves through the drug traffic. This has led to a link of wars from Afghanistan, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, which had suited the purposes for the international oil corporations wanting to control that same territory. It also resulted in a significant increase in drugs use throughout Europe and the United States. Today, drug networks are an important factor in politics. The U.S. returns repeatedly to the posture of fighting a war in areas of petroleum reserves with the aid of drug trafficking allies and revenue. Surprisingly, this is even true in Colombia, where we are nominally fighting a war on drug, yet the chief drug trafficking faction, the paramilitaries, are allies with us because we're the drug traffickers. This is the situation that has currently engaged the U.S. and Afghanistan, a country through which until 1998, a U.S. oil company, Unocal, hoped to build an oil and gas pipeline through. The drug trafficking network of Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, a former CIA ally operating out of the caves designed and paid for by the CIA. So he's saying that bin Laden was trained and paid for by the CIA, which is true, and so was Al-Qaeda. However, it was the Northern Alliance, who was also a drug proxy, that had entered the fray. In the pursuit of bin Laden, the U.S. defeated his allies, and the Taliban, which in 2000 had enforced a total ban on opium cultivation in its area with the aid of the Northern Alliance, which in the same period had overseen a trebling of opium cultivation in the area. So now let me stop right here because I want you guys to understand something. The Northern Alliance was fighting against the rest of the warlords. And the day before 9/11, if I'm not mistaken, the chief of the Northern Alliance was assassinated. Literally the day before 9/11. Because their plan was to go into Afghanistan, and he could not be alive for them to go into Afghanistan after 9/11. And that when I started piecing all of these pieces together, when I found out that this guy was fighting with the Taliban to eradicate opium from Afghanistan, and he was taken out the day before 9/11, it gives you no other place to go but that it was on purpose. As this book goes to press, the new interim Afghan government has initiated a nominal ban on opium cultivation, but the U.S. has not given the Karzai regime enough financial support to make the ban work. It was basically a ban in name only. Nor were they interested in any of the current plans to actually reduce the production of it. Even if there was an effective ban on opium production and trafficking in Afghanistan, one could still predict with some confidence that it would increase in the neighboring areas like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. As the drug traffic grows in the new areas, it will destabilize the host states, just like it did in Afghanistan, because that's the whole purpose. And by the way, Tajikistan is the country that a lot of the Mujahideen and Al Qaeda and ISIS fighters came from, that were used in Chechnya and in many of the other areas like Bosnia. There's a lot of CIA activity in Tajikistan. These problems facing America are by no means entirely of its own making, but obviously its alliance with NATO and other counterparts add to this. It also, he goes on to say that the U.S. dependence on foreign oil as opposed to its own allows us to be manipulated by international oil markets and obviously the international syndicate, which is the reason why they don't want us to produce our own oil. So the great resistance that still exists to acknowledging past U.S. involvement in and responsibility for covert intrigues contribute to our present inability to bring true peace and security to any region of the world. To put it in terms I find more precise, he's the guy that uses the term parapolitics. The exercise of power by covert means tends to metastasize into deep politics and interplay of unacknowledged forces over which the original parapolitic agent no longer has control. This is the heart of the analysis that he does. And keep in mind, we just finished the book about parapolitics, so definitely the consistency on the subject. He also wrote a book on deep politics in the death of JFK, which gave an example of the parapolitics using mafia figures like Vito Genevieve's in post-war Italy. It was an operation that soon led to the deep political dominance of the Italian party politics by a mafia out of control. In a 1951 decision was made to ship arms and supplies to the KMT army of Chiang Kai-shek in Burma. This led to a fivefold increase in the Burmese opium production from 80 to 400 tons by 1999, the peak year before the ban was imposed by the Taliban. the world opium production had reached 7,000 tons. Of this, 4,700 tons, or 70% of it, was grown in Afghanistan and trafficked by heirs of the Mujahideen, who were in the 1980s financed, armed, and trained by the CIA, which is exactly what happened in Southeast Asia and Vietnam before that. The presence of drug trafficking in the background of these interventions is paralleled by considerations about oil. Decisions made freely after World War II helped bring the U.S. into the situation. The risk from terrorism and continually increasing its vulnerability based on the pursuit of oil. Right after World War II, there was a so-called Quincy Agreements with Saudi Arabia in 1945. The U.S. moved to dominate a global system of production and distribution of oil, starting with the Truman Doctrine in 1946. There was a geostrategic thinking about oil. It was based on the containment of the Soviet Union and a determination to control all of the world's oil resources. The pursuit was progressively deformed the domestic U.S. economy and its own oil production. It rendered it unbalanced and dependent on military expenditures because they wanted to build up a strategy of tension by creating military dominions all around the world. And they used it under the precipice of seeking oil when in fact we had all of our own oil supply. We didn't need to do any of that. But if you don't create a false scarcity and you don't have a reason to go build up militaries all over the world to secure oil when we already have our own. Another hologram for us to live in. From the outset, the U.S. strategy in Southeast Asia envisioned protecting what Eisenhower once referred to as the rich empire of Indonesia because their primary export was oil. And of course, we've already went through Indonesia. We know that they had found as early as the 1930s the most purest oil reserve ever in the world. And that they kept it a secret until they overthrew Sukarno in order to put a stooge in there, Suharto, so that they could basically steal it pennies on the dollar. And it didn't even have to go to a refinery. You could use it. It was that pure right out of the ground. So no wonder Eisenhower said that the Indonesian empire was rich, because he knew. By the 1970s, as opium production in Asia had began to shift west from the Golden Triangle to the Golden Crescent, so also was U.S. interventions, first in a covert and then in an overt manner from Indochina, Vietnam, to Afghanistan. From Iran in the 1953, which is when we overthrew Iran's Prime Minister Mossadegh, to Indonesia in 65, when we overthrew Suharto, and to Ghana in 1966, the CIA was involved in the covert overthrow of governments around the world that had threatened to nationalize their oil industries. The U.S. intervention overseas increased in the 1960s, as did the U.S. dependence on overseas oil to meet its demands. When this exposure led to the oil shocks of the 1970s, the U.S. was forced into creating the international flow of oil and a petrodollar agreement. It solved the latter problem by means of secret agreements that maintain the strength of the US dollar at the expense of third world countries. Here's a quote from an article written in 2001 in September, on September 26th. The hidden stakes in the war against terrorism can be summed up in a single word: oil. The map of international sanctuaries and targets in the Middle East and Central Asia is also to an extraordinary degree, a map of the world's energy sources in the 21st century. The defense of these energy sources, rather than simple confrontations between Islam and the West, will be the primary flashpoint of global conflict in the decades to come. So, all of those Neanderthals that are on the internet telling you that the Islamic religion is like, um, the worst thing that ever happened to the world. No, they are being it has been infiltrated and used in a manner to facilitate the exploitation of oil. And again, I'm not pro-Muslim, I'm not anti-Muslim, I'm just making an observation. People that say those kinds of things are ignorant. Okay, so the guy goes on to talk about this oil and terrorism goes hand in hand in Indonesia, Colombia, Somalia, and because of oil pipelines in Chechnya and Kosovo, which of course we know is just a chart of CIA overthrows. So, in short, the origins of global terrorism is rooted in oil, the control and dominance of oil, or as we call it, the International Syndicate, who are all of the oil companies are members of, as well as the bankers that support them. The problem will not be solved by putting more and more troops abroad in any region. The example of a buildup of U.S. arms and personnel in Iran in 1970s was a major cause of the Iranian revolution against the U.S. Supported Shah. Hundreds of millions of U.S. dollars for the Somali dictator Siad Barre encouraged him to pursue increasingly oppressive policies, which led in 1991 to his overthrow. With respect to drugs, I will only say that the U.S. must end those repressive policies that resorts in an effort to maintain high drug prices that strengthen and enrich the international drug traffic. The U.S. balances its payment by secret agreements with Saudi Arabia to recycle petrodollars to the U.S. to ensure that OPEC sales all over the world are dominated in U.S. dollars. This arrangement to ease pressure on the U.S. currency has helped as an inevitable consequence to create debt crises all over the third world. The same secret agreements are perhaps a prime example of how U.S. policy, barely documented, can give rise to global conditions of misery and unrest. Meanwhile, official strategies that enrich the U.S. by impoverishing the rest of the world diminish the possibility of peace and progress for everyone else. Also, the installation of unpopular dictators doesn't help that, such as what we did in Vietnam, Iran, and Somalia. We are still suffering from anti-American reactions to the installation of these dictators. They don't hate us for our freedom. They hate us because we keep fucking with their governments, who then turn around and kill all the people. Okay. A couple other things that I highlighted. Above all, we see the reoccurring lobbying activities of groups like the American Security Council, which we've went over, in which oil companies are represented, as well as lobbying activities of airlines with government contracts for arms shipments and with alleged involvement in drug trafficking and organized crime. The U.S. government demonizes others as terrorists while actually forming an axis of evil by both funding and training and equipping the very terrorists that they supposedly are against. The author is saying, I had a chance to observe the viciousness of this corrupt system in 1987 when I spent 6 months in a Washington think tank supplying documentation to the Kerry Congressional Subcommittee investigating drug trafficking of the Contras. Less alarming to me than the facts were their consequences for those who knew of or reported them. One conscientious witness, a Republican businessman and Reagan supporter, suffered credible death threats that appeared to have been partly acted on. Another, for his pains, were similarly menaced and directly targeted by Oliver North in the White House as a terrorist threat, just for being a whistleblower. Even our think tank were interrogated by the FBI, which was perhaps the least bothersome inconvenience suffered by those promoting the truth. Others were placed on 24-hour surveillance by forces in Washington's police department, and other police departments couldn't even identify who the people were that were doing their surveillance. Other people were also deprived of jobs in the aftermath of having been involved in this effort. In an arrangement that was probably illegal, a CIA top type propaganda campaign was funded through the State Department against American people, targeting for defeat anyone who opposed the Contras that were serving in Congress. Although there was no longer any Cold War pretext for this approach, the coercive forces became stronger than ever. It is clear that at a minimum, the lies are continuing. The nation is being slowly dragged into a conflict. We are in a guerrilla war in Colombia. Our arms and assistance are going to the Colombian military, who work to coordinate the drug trafficking and the paramilitary death squads, not defeat them. In 2001, those death squads' share of the drug trade was estimated to be about 40%. The fundamental Orwellian absurdity of our misnamed war on drugs is totally ignored by the U.S. press. This is part of a predictable pattern, just as in the past, the U.S. press ignored the drug trafficking of our allies in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Central America, and most recently in Kosovo. Also completely ignored is the U.S. press, also ignored by the U.S. press, is the extent to which the oil companies have lobbied for efforts like Plan Colombia, which is actually the name of a effort that brought all of this to bear, Plan Colombia. Just as in the 60s, they pressed for the Saccone Mobil to escalate. Saccone Mobil, which was the oil company affiliated with Vietnam, they also pressed for the Vietnam War. So, there you have it. That's his introduction. So, we've already given the definition of parapolitics, but I did want to say one thing, quote one thing from America's Worst Enemy, the CIA's Secret Powers. This is a quote. Covert power is like nuclear power. It produces life-threatening byproducts, which cumulatively are more and more threatening to the environment supposedly served. The byproducts of covert power include trained terrorists who, in the end, are likely to target their former employers, the incriminating relations to government which hinder these terrorist prosecution, and the ensuing corruption of society at large. The result is deep politics, the immersion of political life in a immobilizing substratum of unspeakable scandal and bad faith. The result of this practice was 9/11, which I agree with 100%. Okay. So, in his introduction, he says that he has explored instances of hidden manipulations at the highest level, which is why it drove him to coin the phrase parapolitical. And by that, he talks about the indirection, collusion, and deceit of politicians in basically a blood sport of politics. It is parapolitics refers to the lethality of politics, where we talk about paramilitary being gladio and all of the dead bodies left in its wake. The same thing happens in the sport or practice of parapolitics, where basically, if you don't go along to get along, you will be expendable. And at the heart of that, that's kind of my problem. I don't want to argue politics, but that's my problem with anybody beating up on Thomas Massey. You can like him or dislike him, but at no time, in my opinion, should the president of the United States say that he is going to basically primary somebody for having a different opinion than he did. That just isn't the way we should do things. As a matter of fact, there shouldn't be any outside involvement in politics within a House district. I don't think people should be able to bring money in to a House run. I don't think money from outside of a state should be used for a Senate run. I don't think any of that should go on. I think people ought to be able to elect who they want to elect. But again, we have parapolitics at play, and that's not the world that we live in. He also uses the term throughout this book, deep politics, which is process, deep politics or deep political processes rather than events, meaning a series of practices at odds with the law and the morals of society, which is usually repressed rather than acknowledged. Deep political processes include parapolitical ones that are more open-ended, parapolitics meaning control. Deep politics can refer to any form of sinister or unacknowledged influence, like all of the covert funding. Some of the bureaucratic manipulations described in this book, such as those of Air America in Laos, strike me as being of some amount of parapolitical intrigue. But underlying Southeast Asia history in these years was the political significant narcotic traffic. The CIA was intimately connected to this traffic, chiefly through its proprietary Air America. But it was not securely in control of the traffic and probably did not even seek to be. I don't agree with that, but what it desired was deniability, and that is true. It was achieved by setting up a front company like Air America, which the CIA actually wholly owned as a corporation that hired pilots and owned aircraft maintenance facilities in none other than Taiwan. Most of its planes, which often carried drugs, were 60% owned and frequently operated by their partners in crime, the Taiwanese KMT army and or political party, depending on what you wanted to call it. The CIA was comfortable in this deniable relationship with people it knew were reorganizing the post-war drug trafficking in Southeast Asia, meaning post-World War II. The US government was determined to ensure that drug trafficking networks and triads in the region remained under KMT's total control, even if it meant logistic and air support to armies in post-war Burma, whose chief activity was expanding opium. The complex legal structure of the airline, CAT, later known as Civil Air Transport and then later Air America, was the ideal vehicle for this support. Some CAT pilots were involved in smuggling during World War II, even before the CIA was set up. The acquisition of CAT was part of a larger strategy whose principal advocate was none other than Major General Claire Chennault. Chennault predicted by the late 1940s that the victory of Mao Zedong in mainland China would be followed by a massive expansion of his influence and a decrease in the access of opium from China. Therefore, he put emphasis on Thailand, Malaya, Burma, and even India as alternative sources. Knowing that the commitment of U.S. troops in response to this threat was not politically possible, Chennault proposed an alternative, using his airline as logistical support for a KMT Chinese army, strengthened by American military advisors. Chennault's project, unpopular at first inside the government, was eventually adopted with the support of Henry Luce of Life magazine and a very effective China lobby. The Chennault plan deserves to be recognized as the prototype for the U.S. use of drug proxies, which had survived down to the 2001 U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. This working alliance with a drug network implemented in the 1950s in Burma would have dangerous consequences. An even more dangerous conspiratorial intrigue emerged in the early 60s when President Kennedy gradually disengaged from the goals of the KMT and the powerful Chinese lobby. They were, the Chinese lobby, still scheming to attack mainland China, and JFK wasn't having anything to do with it. Another enemy. Urged on by the growing evidence of the Chinese-Soviet split, Chiang Kai-shek in 1962 talked openly of an imminent invasion of the mainland. Sounds almost like Cuba. As discussed below, his proposal to Washington to expand the Bay of Pigs type operation on the mainland was endorsed by none other than Ray Klein, who just so happened to be the Taiwanese CIA station chief. He eventually ended up as the CIA Deputy Director of Intelligence, which would be the International Syndicate Intelligence, because they don't do intelligence for the U.S. government or us. The plan was also backed by Admiral Harry Felt, F-E-L-T, commander of the Pacific, which we refer to as SINCPAC or PACOM. Many top U.S. military leaders in the CIA were very sympathetic because, after all, Chiang Kai-shek was a general too. One supporter who went even further was Air America's board chairman and former SINCPAC, Admiral Felix Stump, and we've come across him before, S-T-U-M-P, who publicly called for the defeat of communism in the Far East using tactical nuclear weapons. As is often pointed out, Chiang's efforts in mainland China resulted only in the killing and capture of his agents, but the KMT allies played a successful conspiratorial role in with Air America to destabilize Laos in the 1960s. And even more conspicuously, they succeeded with the help of the CAT airline in building up a post-war drug traffic, which is, by the way, why they were there. Both of these became very significant in the Laotian crisis that was attributed to the U.S. intelligence at the time of the Chinese People's Republic. The KMT political objectives, assets, and allies in Laos can state by then considerable in the international drug trafficking. They were indistinguishable. The CIA fiascos in Laos should concern everyone today, as it turned out, because they began doing the exact same thing in many different areas of the world, to include, in this book, he goes over Colombia and Afghanistan, but they were in Paraguay, Uruguay, Chile, and every other region of the world, Peru, with the whole drug trade. And of course, in order to do that, You have to destabilize that country in order to be able to control it. The following chapters study in reverse chronology the evolution of energies of the CIA Air America KMT complex into the deep politics of oil and drugs in Afghanistan and Colombia. The overall picture is complex, but certain general propositions tend to prevail. Number one, initially, small covert operations lacking proper supervision become budget opportunities to be exploited by a number of different lobbies, from oil to herbicides, chemicals. But I would argue that's the actual purpose of it. I don't think that's a byproduct of it. The second proposition is that off the books proprietaries like Air America survived through the war survives through the war scares that they helped generate. In Air America wake, there was a number of outsourced private corporations like DynCorp, again, which served as trainers and infrastructure for U.S. assets abroad. All of these lacking a regular standing budget requires continuity of U.S. intervention in order for them to make money, which means we're going to always be intervening. A third proposition is that the wisdom calls for moderation in excessive U.S. response will generate a larger budget, and therefore that's what happens. Former U.S. Ambassador Robert White, in this book later on, will be quoted as saying, if you put over 90 cents of your foreign policy dollar into the Pentagon and the CIA, then your policy is going to emphasize a military approach and a secretive, under the table approach to every problem. This 9-to-1 ratio becomes even greater when we compare lobbying and nonprofit interest in the picture. The underreported factor in the political corruption of the U.S. Asian policy has been the input of money, including drug money, from foreign governments through their lobbyists and PR firms. This book will talk about the cash injected into the U.S. political system by the China lobby, allegedly drug financed, to back pro-KMT politicians like Richard Nixon, as the China lobby wand in the 1960s. In its place took the Korea lobby, which of course, I don't know if you guys, I've written about it, the Korea Gate that encompassed Clinton. But back then they're talking about Reverend Moon and the Moonies. Also the World Anti-Communist League and all those people. So Anne Chenault was the Claire Chenault's wife, and she is Chinese. And to this day, money from Reverend Moon's Unification Church was used to create, which we all know, the Korean CIA and the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, which turned into the World Anti-Communist League, and owns the Washington Times. Two deeper factions reinforce the continuity stretched in the preceding discussion about who's all involved. One is the continuing close involvement of regular or rogue CIA officers like Ray Klein and Edwin Wilson at every stage. And remember, Edwin Wilson is the one that owned the company that was trafficking weapons to all of the covert operations for Gladio, that after they outsourced, after Carter got rid of the covert operations, you had Ray Klein put his eyes on Edwin Wilson's business, and they ended up framing him and putting him in prison. Not ever a good idea to do work with the CIA, because when you're no longer needed, you're going to be in a coffin or in a jail cell. Another Not unrelated is the reoccurring allegation that the China Lobby, the Unification Church, and the Anti-Communist League all derived their budgets from drug trafficking, which is in fact true. The origins of this influence, one finds out after realizing that it's drug involved, has to then look at all of the other front companies like Air America, the Civil Air Transport, blah, 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 and realize that they too were involved not only in the drug trafficking, but were being kept up with drug money. These foreign sources lobbying for successive U.S. wars were supported by domestic Washington lobbies, such as the American Security Council, with major oil corporations as members. So, just so that you guys follow this loop, the oil companies create a NGO, nonprofit, called American Security Council. They join it. They donate shit tons of money to it. That's a lobbying effort. Then they put together a counterpart lobbying effort like China Lobby that is in a geographic region that they want to exploit, made up of Chinese people that they've already bought and paid for. Not patriots, not people who want what's best for their country, people that they have bought to be the face of a second lobbying group that makes it look like it's a foreign lobbying group because they're foreigners being paid by the same people in this network. So then those China lobby type organizations come to the US Congress with the money from the oil companies laundered through the American Security Council to pay the politicians to enact the laws and to go to war in areas that's most beneficial to the oil companies. That's what the guy just said. And they use those lobbying companies and PR firms in order to get what they want. And we went over several of the lobbying firms. They use law firms. Anybody that stands in their way gets attacked. So this happened in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Colombia. Socani Oil in Vietnam, the Foreign Oil Companies Group in Afghanistan, and the U.S.-Colombian Business Partnership in Colombia. These ongoing lobbyings undergirded the emergence of foreign lobbies whose names were less revealing of economic interests, like American Friends in Vietnam. Isn't that sweet? And the Committee for a Free Afghanistan, again, like the World Anti-Communist League. Who would not be for that? It's not what it was at all.
Or the World Wildlife Foundation.
Or the World Wildlife Foundation. The Committee for a Free Afghanistan had not a fucking thing to do with freedom in Afghanistan. It had everything to do with they wanted all of their shit because they want a oil pipeline to go across Afghanistan. Such lobbying activities have ranged over a wide spectrum, from overt media activities to covert corruption. Oil companies do not hesitate to associate themselves publicly with the American Security Council or other lobbying groups. On a deep level, there is indirect links to the funds and principles of institutions connected to drug trafficking throughout this entire network. He then goes into a case study for policy deformation, the stringers for Afghanistan. And basically, he says that there is a deep political boondoggle enlarging official policy of how the U.S. in 1986 provided Stinger anti-craft missiles to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. This officially started in October 1986 with certain resistance groups and they began to receive U.S.-made Stinger missiles through the CIA. The Stingers was the most important of many new weapons used in the war because they used them to shoot down Soviet aircraft. Another book claimed that the CIA, most notably, and had their important success because of these Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, which would begin to turn the tide of the war, forcing the Soviet Union aircraft and helicopters to fly at ineffective high altitudes. The first point is that it is by no means clear that the Stingers, as so oftentimes reported, turned the tide. On the contrary, there is subsequent analysis of the Soviet Politburo records by a guy by the name of Alan Cooperman, who says, quote, although counterintuitive and contrary to popular wisdom, it appears the U.S. counter-escalation of 1985 to 86 was largely irrelevant to the Soviets' withdrawal decision in November of 86. This is clearly the case for the Stinger, which was not utilized in Afghanistan until September of 1968, a mere 2 months before the Politburo's decision to withdraw. At the end of November, the Politburo meeting, no mention was even made in any of the notes of the Stinger missile being a factor. Furthermore, the program to supply Stingers, so often touted as successful, became an acute problem afterwards because they were everywhere, which, again, in my opinion, was the whole purpose. And it is likely that the CIA knew the Soviets were going to withdraw, put the Stinger missiles in them so that they can then use them to proliferate and sell on the black market, which they're known to have done multiple times. It goes on to say, in the fall of 1986, for example, Soviet commandos ambushed a group of rebels and captured 2 Stingers. In June of 1987, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards either seized or bought at least 16 Stinger missiles from the rebels. One of the Stingers and a launcher turned up in the fall of 1987 on an Iranian speedboat that was captured after it fired on a U.S. Navy helicopter gunship. Yeah, that was a really good idea. Just put all those Stinger missiles over there so that they can be used to kill Americans, as we know happened later. The CIA in 1989 and 1990 had to allocate millions in a desperate attempt to minimally be successful at buying back unused Stinger missiles. Fear that the Taliban might possess as many as 300 of them was the reason the U.S. in 2001 initially concluded its air war in Afghanistan from such high altitude, or conducted, because they didn't want their aircraft being shot down with their own Stinger missiles because they're a bunch of dumbasses. The leading impetus to supply the Stingers did not come, allegedly, some people were trying to say that the whole idea behind how those Stinger missiles got there was from Congress itself. Gee, I wonder who would have been blaming Congress for that. Not that Congress wouldn't have been involved, because again, that's the whole purpose of the intelligence aspect of Congress. So, who knows? Although other senators and congressmen were involved, the key instigator was none other than Charlie Wilson, who also was associated with the American Security Council. Now, he is going to be the guy behind a lot of this as far as getting the funding for it. That does not mean that he wasn't owned lock, stock, and barrel by the CIA, because he was. In the fall of 83, Charlie Wilson, Democrat from Texas, started a campaign to supply the guerrillas with more effective anti-aircraft weapons. And by guerrillas, he means the CIA. Opposition to the stinger was so great that we had to settle for something less. By the end of 1983, Mr. Wilson persuaded his colleagues to provide $40 million for weapons, and much of it went for a powerful anti-aircraft gun made by a Swiss company called OERLIKON. You know, Switzerland, the neutral country. The guerrillas began to get the automatic cannon in late 1984. For several months, conservative groups had criticized the CIA on the grounds that they were not interested in getting the weapons that they thought necessary to the guerrillas. In early March 1986, Reagan approved delivery of the missiles, because of course he did. From a historical perspective, the decision to provide stingers in 86 flowed from National Security Decision Directive 166 of March 1985, signed by Reagan, and looked to support a victory in Afghanistan. Clearly, however, the momentum had shifted from 83 through 84 when the U.S. covert military aid to the Afghan rebels, then stable at $30 million a year, more than doubled. $60 million. That's just crazy. The final 1986 Stinger decision was an outgrowth from this, and lobbying from people like the American Security Council, which is basically a CIA front for the international syndicate. One such interest was the American Security Council, which took an active interest in lobbying every effort to go to war from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Charlie Wilson himself was a member of their task force on Central America that got involved in Colombia. So, the American Security Council staff member, Odile, Odile English, toured Afghanistan several times in the 80s before becoming the PR director for the Committee for a Free Afghanistan, which is basically the CIA front for lobbying for a war in Afghanistan. And more recently, he was a lobbyist for the Northern Alliance. The chair of the Committee for a Free Afghanistan was none other than Major General Milner Roberts, retired, who was also vice president of the American Security Council. So they're basically one and the same. So, I think we're going to stop there. There's a lot more, but we're going to stop there.
Boy, once you recognize the patterns and you're going through these books, it's just, as you put it, you can see the hallmarks of it all over the place, and that's what points you to digging deeper and finding out the truth.
Well, what's interesting to me is we find out, obviously, the names of all of these organizations, and we are watching this play out in real time now, with the names of organizations that are like the American Security Council, that are similar. You know, we found out about all of the NED organizations. These are things that we found early on, 2 years ago. And they are the kind of the underbelly of the coordination of how this machine operates. They use the PR firms, they use the law firms, and they use the lobbying firms in order to generate the narrative, the psychological operation surrounding the covert operation that they're about ready to pull off. And that's why I'm now more in tune to looking for the trends like I'm seeing with the Taliban. When they start building a narrative, that means they're about to launch an operation. Carrie, go ahead.
Bless their heart. So, the neutral country that has Basel as a city, right? And they housed IBS, and they did that before the UN with the League of Nations, that neutral country.
You're referring to Switzerland. And the same thing with Sweden. They both have an extensive banking, military, economic connection to everything that happens in the world. They have never been neutral. It was a cloaking device that allowed them to operate covertly in just about every event in world history. So, anybody else got anything? Go ahead, SR71.
Thank you, Pearl, and thank everybody for attending. I don't know how many books you've gone through at this point, but it's very evident that from all the books we've been through, it's amazing how the same names keep cropping up time and time again. These books are acting as props for truth. I mean, if you're going to get it from 20 different places, you're going to get it from 20 different places. Of course, there may be some bit of bias in there and some other stuff that goes on, but it's easy enough to tell what's really going on. And I don't know. I'm kind of floored by that fact, but then again, it's like, where are all the other players? Because I know there's definitely a lot more. They're there. We just haven't uncovered them yet.
Well,
it's the same names that keep popping up.
You know what? Yeah, you know what's most interesting about that to me is if you read these people's backgrounds, these different authors, and how they come about it. If you look at their references, which I pay a lot of attention to verify what they're, every once in a while they're going to throw something in that I don't think quite fits the flow of the information or whatever. But a lot of them use different sources, and that's kind of what floors me. Is I can read, for example, I have here the book Intimate Ties, Bitter Struggles. It's about Latin America, of which Colombia is a small portion of. I just finished this book. It's called The China Lobby in American Politics, which obviously dovetails into what I was just reading. I got that book after it was used as a reference in the World Anti-Communist League, which kind of turned me on to the fact that it was a good source. So I bought it. This guy uses completely different references in the book we were just reading, Drugs, Oil, and War. And so you have all of these different people writing about this information, and yet none of us have ever heard of it. That's what's so mind-boggling to me.
Because they're intentionally, well, the news media, the coverage of it, of any of this, is intentionally obfuscated, hidden, made light of. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, and then when the truth does finally come out, it's completely not even reported.
Or they come out with, oh, that got debunked a long time ago.
Right. Or, yeah, and that's one of the things, discrediting the truth, wrapping the truth up with a lie, and then releasing it in order to Just print the actual truth.
Which is why if you come into my threads, into my page, and you start spouting off shit that has no references and expect me to allow you to occupy a place there to spout garbage, you are going to get called out. I read every one of you guys' comments. I cherish every one of you guys' feedback. And you guys know I will try to respond to every single one of you. Some of the comments now that X has gotten screwed up gets lost. Excuse me. I'll go down like 50 comments and then my whole screen turns blank and I can't get back to the rest of them that are below that point. So if I've been away for a few hours, there's a chance that I won't see it, but generally I see them all. And I see them all because, again, most of the information that I have comes from you guys. It's not stuff that I found. And that's the reason why I'm like addicted to keeping our, and I view my page as our collection of facts. So if you come in and you start spousing bullshit and I give you facts that counter your bullshit and you just go on and act like an asshole, you will get blocked because I don't want your shit on my page. I don't want anybody coming here and reading stuff that's garbage and then accusing me of entertaining it when it's garbage. So if you want to be here, I love that you're here, but I want you bringing facts, not bullshit. SR71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel. I wanted to add to that because when you do jump on some of these people, I have taken some personal chuckles in the way our crowd has jumped right in there and bashed them as well, to say the least. But anyway, the other thing I was looking at more in tune with today and what's going on is we've already seen cyber attacks on oil. We've seen cyber attacks on X now. We've seen cyber attacks on Microsoft. So I'm thinking here that it won't be long before we get, and our communications as well. So I'm thinking here it won't be long before we get the triple, quadruple whammy. It's going to come. The question now is when. And when it does, hopefully people won't go bananas.
I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I have no clue. Bridget, go ahead.
Just wanted to join in on that. And I don't know if you or SR or any of the audience caught that. When this started breaking out yesterday, when we start noticing these patterns, it becomes part of our subconscious, part of how your brain works. Who is not on X and isn't on any social media platforms, I started to realize that this was the same CIA tactics as they have used whenever a city or a group or a leader has began to buck the authority of the CIA. The bombing campaign, that's what they did. They bombed X. The terror campaigns that they're starting to amp up on the Tesla factories, that's what they've done. Strategy of tension. This is all part of this same playbook. We're now starting to see it play out in front of our eyes, whereas in the past, we were not privy to it while it was going on. It's my opinion.
Well, we saw them as separate things. We saw them as not necessarily related to each other. And I think now, knowing how their network is set up, you can clearly see how things are knitted together.
well, just like disappearing people and disappearing people online, their form of censorship is as you pointed out a long time ago, censorship online is the same as they disappeared people in physical bodily form in the past.
Right. Right. Correct. Miles, go ahead.
Yeah, there was a little delay here, but this is for SR 71. I did hear what you said, and I think for years when I've been researching this stuff, I thought that our side had set up counter moves and defense tactics against what they were going to do. I think Elon's part of that. And he made a really interesting statement the other day where he was saying that the deep state are the bureaucrats, that they think they have more power than anybody that we elect. And Doge is changing that. It's a big threat to their system that they've got set up. And but I do think, part of the plan that they had to get access to the same technology that the bad guys had to do a counterattack. And I do think we're in a counter revolution right now. So I'm not that worried. Maybe the colonel's not that worried either. I know there's going to be attacks, but we can counter them. And that's what we're all about. We're countering the news cycle all the time with the truth. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with that. One of the things which I think is vital about Starlink, you guys have to remember that every single Starlink, and there's like a ton of them up there now, has a portion of the Starlink satellite dedicated to military use only. So what they did, just think of it as a pie. A percentage of that pie is restricted for military use only. And so the deployment of Starlink has changed everything. You could cut every cable on an ocean floor and not stop communication now. The ability of all of this, there was so many things that had to be put into place. The ability to communicate on social media. Yes, True Social was kind of the holdover for all of us to hang out on until X got bought and cleaned up. And so every one of these steps had to be taken in order for us to have the ability to work through this and communicate with each other. And so people don't get distraught or lost in the struggles that are going to be coming up as we move forward. So it's very important. Richard, can you mute your mic, please? Yeah. It's very important to understand that there's an entire thing that we do not see that is good that goes along with the thing that we cannot see that is bad. Illini, go ahead.
Hey, Colonel.
Hey.
Thinking through like all the retaliation going on, all this sort of weird covert retaliation going on with Tesla Cybertrucks getting firebombed and stuff like that. I'm wondering if there are any instances of democratic countries who've kind of gone through this and figured out a good way of dealing with it. I don't know if Duterte in the Philippines might kind of be a potential analog here. I know that he had to go up against a whole bunch of, crime syndicates and drug lords and stuff like that. There's a little bit of rough justice involved, but then, the Marcos family came back. I don't know if there's a potential approach to dealing with all of this, or kind of what the strategy would be, and finally, how do we, assuming that the attacks stop and they manage to sort of fend them off, how do we kind of move back towards normalcy as well.
So that's a very interesting. So this is going to sound completely off the wall to most people, but I know you'll understand this. If you go back and you look at like the Sandinistas, they're still in charge. They were under attack, but they survived. They survived hundreds of millions of dollars being dumped into a country, Nicaragua, that had like $100 to $200 a month normal pay rates. Okay, so can you imagine hundreds of millions of dollars being spent in Nicaragua to overthrow a government who withstood all of the efforts to do that? Now, obviously, during Iran-Contra, there was all kinds of garbage going on. But they're doing it right now. They are literally right now still trying to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. And they ain't having it. And they didn't close down the press like Zelensky did. They didn't outlaw religion. They didn't do any of that crap. They've lived through a perpetual attack on their country and gave the U.S. the middle finger because they're still standing. Unfortunately, every one of those success stories we've been taught to hate. Castro was another one. Attacked. They launched like 400 assassination attempts at that guy. Still left standing till the day he died. They did the same thing with Venezuela. So unfortunately, those are the people that you have to look at, because all of the non-controversial ones are non-controversial because they either walked away because they were bribed to walk away, or was killed in office, or like in most of today's case, in prison for life. So it is a very interesting dynamic when you begin looking at it.
And for the record, I don't know who the good guys and the bad guys are in the Philippines today, but
all you have to do is look at who the CIA's or who the U.S. government saying is the bad guys. They're always the good guys.
Fair enough. I hope that we can come up with a way of dealing with this that's relatively fair and just, but also works around the issues around retaliation too.
Yeah, I agree. Miles, go ahead.
I had an interesting conversation this morning that took me on not so much a rabbit hole, but just to do some research. And this kind of ties in. I don't know if it really ties in with Gladio, but I have a wish list of DOEs as far as where I want them to do an audit. And the Smithsonian Institute came up in our conversation. I went, well, yeah, the government owns that. And what's in there as far as historical stuff? Did they take anything from these countries? Like booty, and it's in the Smithsonian. Now, I mean, the numbers, look, it's not a high priority list. I get it, because they only have a limited amount of time. But I would really like to know if there's like currency that they took that was really old, or just, artifacts from these countries. Because you know how they are. They got to take the booty with them too. It's kind of like a prize. I don't know.
Are you asking if they did that? Of course they did that. They did it. They got caught doing it in Iraq. It was the first place they went.
Well, would you like to see what's in the basement of the Smithsonian? They do an audit of that place?
Sure. I think everything that the government has ought to be audited.
We got you today. Woo-hoo! Oh my gosh. I was so angry. I know that they had those, supposedly whatever was going on yesterday with X or whatever, but man, I thought it was because they were just attacking you, not letting you open, because Monday was a pain in the butt and everything. Oh, but I'm so glad you're here. I don't know if you guys watched that show. Well, I know that you don't, Colonel Towner, but there was a show that was on Sci-Fi called Warehouse 13.
And I used to think that that's what they used to do with all the artifacts, because there's all kinds of stuff that they take and they probably have it shipped in places all over the world, like the giants and all kinds of other stuff, that they plummet through, yeah, definitely. I'm sure that they need to do an audit on it. I'm sure that there's all kinds of fun stuff in there too. They suck.
So let me share with you guys something that we found that I didn't even know existed. In ports, which is why ports are so important, there are warehouses that are dubbed not part of the country. And just for example, if you have, like, say, most of them that the story was about was in the Mediterranean area. So let's just say that you have a port in Spain, and something is arriving in the port from, say, Cyprus. And there's a warehouse that's dubbed part of the international, not Spanish territory. So that warehouse is, because it's duty free, a storage for lots of illicit things that have been stolen that they want to hide, or they have used money laundered money to buy, and they need to hide it out until they have income enough to supposedly be able to afford this thing, and then they could take it out like a piece of art and hang in their house or whatever. So there's tons of these warehouses all over the world. And there was this famous weapons smuggler that we came across like a year and a half ago, and he was smuggling out of the Mediterranean area, Cyprus, Malta, Italy, and all of those. His wife at the time was somewhat, just from hanging around in dinners and stuff like that, aware of all of these artifacts being purchased with illicit funds. And so she knows that that's the business that her husband's in. Well, lo and behold, he has an affair and his wife's going to divorce him. And so she starts ratting this guy out, saying that there's all of this shit in these warehouses that he has hidden. And then there's this international crisis because no one actually has jurisdiction over these supposed duty-free warehouses in these port authorities. And they interviewed one guy that was like a custodian in one of them, and they're all temperature controlled. They're all highly guarded with security cameras everywhere. And he basically anonymously was telling people some of the shit that was in the warehouse that he happened to have access to from a custodial perspective. Of course, he did the interview anonymously, and didn't know what most of the art was. But in describing it for the interview, it was quite obvious that there were pieces of art in there that had long ago been stolen. And it was surmised that the way in which it was acquired was also using money laundered funds. And so a lot of that stuff exists out there that we don't even know anything about. Bridget, go ahead.
They have them here in Vegas. Yes, they're all over the place.
Yeah.
One of the biggest discoveries of that exact same thing, to the point, is UNESCO. UNESCO goes in, and we were able to continuously track their movements in and out of war zones, almost as if there was an area that had a large amount of historic sites. skirmishes would break out in those skirmish areas, and they would declare that area a heritage site. And in many cases, they were even thrown out of these countries because when the skirmishes would break out, they would literally box up all the artifacts and ship them out of the country for, quote, safekeeping so that they were not destroyed during these wars. Now, the real question is, where are they? Because they never returned them, ever returned them. And it reminds me of the golden Buddhas and so on and so forth that we covered in the Gold Warriors.
Yeah.
They, if anything, are resourceful in using a war for multiple purposes. And there's a lot. And like I said, they've been thrown out of countless countries who are doing this.
Good point. SR-71, go ahead.
You just got me thinking about that, Colonel. I'm thinking maybe some natural disasters would definitely piss a lot of people off. If you catch my drift.
Well, I will tell you, not very long after we made the discovery of these duty-free warehouses in these international ports, did that Beirut port blow up. The one in Lebanon, that like just massive explosion. And of course, that was the first thing I thought of was, I wonder if somebody blew up one of their warehouses. I don't think that's the case, but that is the first thing I thought of. Stellar, go ahead.
After World War II, because the Nazis were really into like a lot of these artifacts and stuff because of supernatural as well. I mean, I guess a lot of these weird people do, but there is no. I mean, I think that last few years I saw something that came up where they did go into one of these vaults or whatever you want to call them. I don't know where it was at. I don't know which country, but they did find quite a bit of looted, like how the Nazis took artwork and stuff like that. So supposedly the families have it documented. So I guess it's being dispersed around. But I want to say about 5 years ago, there was one that was discovered.
Huh. That's interesting. Carrie, go ahead.
Can I ask Stellar something, Colonel?
Sure.
Okay. Stellar, I'm a little confused about Basel and the corruption, the Basel you talk about, and the corruption in Basel, Switzerland, and the IBS. Can you talk about that?
Okay, so so the banking cartels, when we turned into fiat, they have to say what they're going to be doing. So Basel I was established when we switched over from where we were back in the 60s and 70s, because we weren't completely on, go back or whatever. It was already switching over. But right before we turned into the fiat system, complete the petrodollar, Basel I went into effect. It was bankers that got together in Basel, Switzerland, hence why they call it Basel. And that's where they, like their rules or whatever for the banking of international settlements. It's the settlements that they're, but it's the banking rules and they're like how things are settled instantaneously or however long it takes. But that's what it was. That's where the Basel protocols came into effect. So there wasn't really much written for Basel I, but it was, they didn't do much with it because they already had their plan going or whatever. But when everything fell apart, I want to say after, 9/11, and then especially when I feel that the banking system was under control was back in 2007 and 2008, when the banks fell. That's when they started writing more. They started writing and filling in stuff for Basel II, and then Basel III were written out, and Basel IV. We're up to like 6 or 7. I think that they're still working on 6 and forward, but Basel IV is already written out. There's timelines in it. Basel III, we're finishing up on it. It got postponed by a few years with England. And then with what's going on with the U.S., because we had to postpone some of the stuff, and that's where the ISOs come into play, because in the Basel protocols, they talk about the messaging services, and that's all that the ISOs are. Does that help?
I'm just a little confused because I really don't trust Switzerland, but you seem to be behind it. You seem to be behind the Basel.
Read them. Start reading number 1. It was deep state controlled at that point. Start reading Basel number 2. And when it went into effect, and you're going to start seeing that things started changing. And then when we get to Basel 3, it changes even more, even to the point of they give you the rules on like how much they could have for assets. So for a long time, banks did not have really money. They might have had a little bit of money in it or whatever, but they were not required to carry the assets or have the assets, okay? Then they started switching it, so that then it became where they could not hold stocks and stuff like that as hard assets within the banking system. So then you saw disruptions, like when Trump went into office the first time and second, like the first time, there was disruptions and stuff because Basel III was, things were going into effect with it. And for me, I look at like the equity or assets to the bank. So by the time Endgame starts, which was postponed, now it's going to be July 14th is when it gets implemented, and banks have to have 16.5% gold, silver, hard assets, not real estate, because real estate can drop. We learned that. Stock market can drop, so that's not hard assets, but gold and silver are. And so if you start reading it, you'll start seeing where the monetary system and the banking systems started leaning towards the people. It can't be changed overnight. So I'm sure that they'll be doing it, and it'll continue to go on and on and on. But as it goes on, it's getting stronger for the people. The banking systems are losing their power, and that's what you can read through those.
Thank you. I will read it. Thank you so much.
Go ahead, Miles.
Colonel, I'm so glad that you gave me some Gladio glasses. I didn't know they were programmable. So now I can see so many different things. Stella, I'm going to send you some videos. The Ripple logo, it kind of looked just like that, the World Cup trophy. Like, why would the World Cup trophy look like Ripple? I can see so many things. Thanks, Colonel.
Thank you. Yeah, they're a blessing and curse all at the same time. Anybody else got anything?
They're going down. They're going down. We see it. We're going to make sure we're going to keep pushing and pumping it out there and waking people up, because that is the only way that we're going to get this stuff out. I love you, Colonel Towner, Bridget, SR.
Thank you. So
we love you too, Stellar.
We definitely love Stellar. So I did want to go over the rest of the schedule for the week. I will be on, I see her down in the listener area as well, Reaper Kitty's Space again tonight at 8. So Eastern time. Also tomorrow, 9:30, we will be finishing up on the Alpha Warrior show, the misnamed Office of Public Safety, which is notorious for murdering and torturing people. And then on Thursday at noon, we will resume the Secret Society Skull and Bones presentation with Warhamster. And I can tell he's raring to go. And then we will be obviously having throughout this whole week our 4 p.m. one. Friday is going to get a little dicey because we are traveling. Next week is the local spring break here. So my daughter will be off. I will be off grandma duty, and we are going to go out in the RV. And we're going to be in the northeast portion of Georgia, around
Mobile Command Center is what we like to call it.
Mobile Command Center. So if I'm in a place where I can actually have the show at 4 p.m. on Friday, I will. Otherwise, we will probably have one on Saturday to make up that time. And then I will just work around a schedule, hopefully from 4 to 6, all of next week, even though we are going to be up in Georgia during that time. So just FYI, that's what the next week looks like. And we will be continuing with our book during that time. Miles, go ahead.
Savoy Brown is one of my favorite bands.
What is?
Savoy Brown. You went to the concert.
Savoy Brown. I don't know what you're talking about.
Sawyer Brown?
Sawyer Brown.
Sawyer Brown.
Sawyer Brown was probably the best conference, or I don't know. I love Reba, but Sawyer Brown puts on a better show. If you're not at like one of the big stadium venues for Reba where she changes outfits like every third song, Sawyer Brown puts on a show, and it was a really, really good concert. Yeah. So kind of melancholy. The Strawberry Festival is over for another year, but at the same time, it's all consuming. So much crap. We have people that fly in from all over, to include Detroit. Then they want to go to spring training games and everything else. So it is a lot of stuff to do in a short amount of time. Not that I'm complaining, because I absolutely love it. But anyway.
I was also going to say that we do know that the Cabal is losing money because Las Vegas went down, I think they said 30 to 40% from last year's gaming revenue. So it's getting harder to launder that money.
Oh, darn. That's very interesting.
If you keep an eye on like the gaming stuff, gaming stocks, or like what revenue is coming in, because they have to report it through the state and things like that, massive downfall. Macau started going down a couple of years ago. So, China was getting cleaned out. That's how I look at, again, because of the money and baking and stuff. And I've always felt that, wherever they have gaming, it's just laundering. And the revenue went down considerable from last year. They're running out of it.
Which kind of goes hand in hand with what we were seeing in some of the desperateness of the CIA intervening in the foreign policy of funding Ukraine, which had never happened because they had their own separate laundered money. And the involvement of their advocacy for sending money to Ukraine was something that I had never seen. And I've been watching this for a while. And it was very telling to me that someone has gotten to their source of money. So that's interesting that you say that. That's just another indication to watch. So there you have it. All right.
Well, after learning about Gladio and not even realizing that the mob was a big part of Gladio, I mean, look at the roots of Nevada.
Right.
The mob was running it, and then it became corporate, which is the corporate legal mob. And it's the same thing that went on with Gladio in all these different countries and stuff like that, in my personal opinion, especially early on in Italy and things. So, yeah, it's just another form of watching it,
That's a very good point.
Interesting.
Yeah. Very good point. It is. And I mean, just the fact that we were going over Howard Hughes the other day and his presence in Las Vegas, and how he was intimately involved in the other side of that too. So it is definitely an interesting small world, if you will, as we read all of these different books and put all of these players together. So yeah, very interesting.
Check your DM, Stella.
Carrie, go ahead.
And who set up shop right across from him?
Across from who?
The name you just gave, I'm sorry.
Howard Hughes.
Yeah, someone set up, is it Trump? Who did that?
In front of where he was at. Yes, that's what Stellar was telling us last week. So, yep.
Yes, Stu McCall, the Howard.
I think you got cut off, Stellar. All right, guys. I think that's going to do it. I appreciate everybody being here. And we're going to call it an evening. And we will be back tomorrow at 4. And I will be on let's see, let me bring that back up just to run through it again real quick. Reaper Kitty tonight at 8 Eastern, and Alpha Warrior tomorrow at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. So see you guys all then. Thanks for being here. All right, guys. Thank you all for being in the chat. Appreciate it. Love you guys being here. Donnie Vision, just in time to catch the end. You got to go back. This is going to be a very interesting book. Just so that you know, Donnie Vision, this is the book we're doing. Drugs, Oil, and War by Peter Dale Scott. And he talks about Afghanistan, Colombia, and Vietnam, basically. So it'll be a very interesting portrait of all of these three things kind of in one book, evaluated next to each other to show kind of the patterns. So it's a good book. Take care, everybody.